In the cold opulence of a mansion that should have been a sanctuary, the wealthy grandson, with a heart as icy as his ambitions, orchestrated unspeakable torment. He tied his elderly grandmother to the bed, her bonds as tight as the greed that consumed him. Not content with the frail woman's immobility, he opened the doors to horror, luring a swarm of sewer rats, filthy and starving creatures, to attack the defenseless lady. The air filled with the squeaking and scratching of claws, a macabre prelude to the end he desired. But on the threshold of darkness, nature responded. An alpha wolf, with dark fur and flashing eyes, burst into the room. There was no hesitation in its movements. With instinctive protective fury it charged, slaughtering the rodents one by one, its teeth and claws, transforming the threat into a visceral spectacle. The rat's blood spread across the floor, forming a scarlet barrier, a wild circle of protection around the grandmother, a shield of life forged in death to safeguard the woman. In that frozen instant, the mansion's air, previously saturated with the repulsive squeaking of rodents, now pulsed with the heavy silence of death and the metallic scent of blood. Clara, the grandmother trapped in her bed, could not look away. Her eyes, which moments before had reflected the terror of being devoured alive, now fixed on the alpha wolf. The creature, a vision of savage power and dark beauty, stood there amidst the massacre it had orchestrated. Its dark fur, splattered with vibrant red, formed a shocking contrast with the cold opulence of the room. The wolf did not move. It was a statue of contained fury, an unexpected guardian. The scarlet barrier of blood and rat remains it had created seemed to pulse with primal energy, a visceral shield separating life from death, innocence from cruelty. Clara felt the strange warmth of that bloody perimeter, a macabre irony that somehow offered a sense of security against the cold that enveloped her. Her heart beat wildly, a frantic drum in her aged chest. It was a mix of terror and a spark of hope she hadn't felt in years. Was this a miracle, or just a different predator awaiting its turn? Her mind, blurred by age and shock, struggled to process the unreality of the scene. On the threshold of the door, the grandson Arthur was petrified. His eyes, once bright with sadistic satisfaction, were now wide with disbelief and icy terror. His meticulous plan, his masterpiece of torment, had been dismantled in seconds by a creature that defied all logic. A wolf inside his mansion. It wasn't possible. The image of the animal, slaughtering the rats with brutal efficiency, seared itself into his retina. The blood, the smell, the savagery, it was all real. The wolf, as if sensing the intruder's presence, slowly moved its head. Its eyes, which had previously gleamed with the fury of the hunt, now fixed on Arthur. A low growl, a guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, echoed through the room. It wasn't a warning growl, it was a promise of contained violence, of a power Arthur had never even imagined. Arthur's face, usually a mask of arrogance and control, contorted into an expression of pure panic. He stumbled back a step, then another. His inheritance plans, his desires for power, all seemed insignificant before that wild gaze. This was no stray dog. This was an alpha predator in its territory, and Arthur, the hunter, had become the hunted. His eyes swept the room, desperate for an exit, for a weapon, for anything that could restore his control. But there was nothing. Only the wolf, his bound grandmother, and the smell of blood. The silence that followed the wolf's growl was deafening, broken only by Clara's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of Arthur's heart. Clara watched the confrontation, a strange calm beginning to settle over her. The wolf, an untamed force of nature, against her grandson, a force of human cruelty, a battle of instincts against depravity, a spark of hope, once fragile, now burned with surprising intensity. She didn't know what would happen, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone. Arthur, driven by a mix of fear and insane stubbornness, refused to be subdued by an animal. His eyes fell upon a heavy bronze candelabra on a nearby dresser. With a sudden movement, he grabbed it, the cold, heavy metal in his trembling hands. It was a pathetic weapon against the creature before him, but it was all he had. He raised the candelabra, a desperate and foolish gesture of defiance. The wolf's growl intensified, transforming into a deep, menacing sound that vibrated in the air. The creature took a step forward, its powerful paws crushing the rodent remains on the floor. Its eyes, fixed on Arthur, were pools of darkness and fury. There was no hesitation, only the promise of a brutal response. The wolf needed no words to communicate its intent. Its entire body, every tense muscle, every bristling hair, spoke a universal language of dominance and danger. Arthur, with the candelabra raised, felt the floor give way beneath his feet, not from physical weakness, but from the overwhelming force of the wolf's presence. He was cornered not only by the beast, but by the consequences of his own wickedness. The macabre dance was just beginning. Arthur, the bronze candelabra heavy in his trembling hands, was a pathetic figure, a dethroned king in his own castle. The gleam of the metal, once a symbol of his wealth and power, now reflected only the terror in his wide eyes. The wolf's growl was not just a sound. It was a deep vibration that traveled through the marble floor, up his legs, and lodged in his chest, compressing his lungs until each breath became an agonizing effort. The rarefied air of the opulent mansion, once a symbol of his dominion, now seemed to suffocate him. The wolf, with a movement that defied logic and gravity, did not attack immediately. Instead, it moved. One step, then another, slowly circling the scarlet barrier of blood and death it had created. Its eyes, beacons of primal instinct, never left Arthur. It was a cruel dance, a macabre ballet where the mouse was armed with a useless object and the cat was an untamed force of nature, a spectre of wild fury. Arthur felt cold sweat trickle down his forehead, mixing with the feverish heat of his panic. His mind, usually so sharp and calculating, was in tatters, unable to formulate a plan, a strategy against that creature which defied all his certainties. Clara, tied to the bed, watched everything with a complex mixture of horror and a strange, almost guilty, satisfaction. Her eyes, previously fixed on the wolf, now divided between the beast and her grandson. This was Arthur, the boy she had loved, pampered, and who now revealed himself to be a monster of cruelty. The fear on his face was real, palpable, and Clara could not look away. It was justice, perhaps, in a brutal and unexpected form, coming from the depths of the forest to correct the imbalances of civilization. The smell of blood, once nauseating, now seemed like a perfume of vengeance, a warning to anyone who dared cross the limits of humanity. The wolf, her unlikely protector, was a mirror of the savagery Arthur had awakened, an unstoppable force he himself had summoned. Arthur tried to move, to retreat, but his feet seemed rooted to the cold marble. The wolf stopped just a few feet from him and lowered its head slightly. It was not a gesture of submission, but of assessment, of a predator studying its prey. A deeper growl, almost a guttural rumble, escaped its throat, a sound that seemed to come from within the earth. Arthur, in a fit of irrational panic, swung the candelabra. The metal whirred in the air, a hollow and ineffective sound, a pathetic lament amidst the rising tension. The wolf was not intimidated. Its lips curled back, revealing fangs sharp as daggers, white against the darkness of its mouth. It was a clear warning, a promise of pain and retribution, a warning that Arthur, in his blind desperation, seemed utterly unable to comprehend. He was blinded by terror, by the humiliation of being hunted in his own home, an intruder in his own dominion. Suddenly, the wolf lunged, not at Arthur but to the side, blocking the door. With impressive agility, it positioned itself between Arthur and the only exit from the room, cutting off any escape route. The sound of its claws on the floor, the dry crunch of rodent bones crushed under its paws, echoed like thunder in the silent chamber. Arthur staggered back, the candelabra falling from his numb hands with a dull thud, the metal rolling across the floor until it stopped near the blood barrier. He was trapped, cornered. The wolf no longer needed to growl. Its presence was enough. The beast was not just an animal. It was the embodiment of judgment, a spectre of his own cruelty returning to haunt him. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine, but it wasn't just fear. It was a dark, almost jubilant expectation. The wolf, its eyes fixed on Arthur, seemed to read her grandson's soul, stripping bare his wickedness with brutal clarity. Arthur, now disarmed, was cowering against the wall, his eyes sweeping the room in search of an escape that didn't exist. The luxury he so cherished, the silk and gold-adorned walls, the expensive furniture, all transformed into a gilded cage. The smell of blood, once a mere detail of the horror, now permeated every fiber of the air, a constant reminder of the violence that had been unleashed and which now turned against its creator. The wolf took another step, then another, closing the distance between them with a calculated slowness that was more terrifying than any attack. Its muscles twitched beneath its dark fur, each movement a promise of brutal force and a veiled threat. Arthur, his face pale and sweating, felt the warmth of the wolf's breath on his skin, the wild, damp scent mixing with the metallic aroma of blood. He closed his eyes, a silent scream trapped in his throat, the sound of his own heart beating like a war drum in his ears. The macabre dance had reached its climax. The wolf stood there imposing, mere inches away, and Arthur, the predator, was now the prey, at the mercy of the nature he had so brazenly defied. The silence in the room was broken only by Arthur's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of Clara's heart. The wolf, a living shadow, seemed to savor its victim's terror, prolonging the moment, transforming it into an eternity of dread. The silence in the room was broken only by Arthur's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of Clara's heart. The wolf, a living shadow, seemed to savor its victim's terror, prolonging the moment, transforming it into an eternity of dread. Its eyes, once pools of fury, now gleamed with a cold, calculating intelligence, studying Arthur as an entomologist studies a trapped insect. The animal's warm, wild breath, laden with the metallic scent of blood and the musk of the forest, enveloped Arthur, suffocating him with the reality of his insignificance. Arthur, cowering against the silk wall, felt the soft texture of the fabric against his back, a cruel contrast to the harshness of the death awaiting him. His wide eyes fixed on the wolf's fangs. White and sharp as newly forged blades, he could feel the uncontrollable tremor in his own limbs, the bile rising in his throat. The world had shrunk to this room, this wolf, this moment of absolute terror. The bronze candelabra, his pathetic weapon, lay forgotten, a mute reminder of his impotence. The wolf, with a slow and deliberate movement, lowered its head, brushing its muzzle against Arthur's shoulder. It wasn't an attack, but a provocation, a visceral reminder of death's proximity. The animal's rough fur scraped Arthur's skin through his silk shirt, and the wild scent permeated every pore. Arthur shuddered, a muffled groan escaping his cracked lips. He tried to pull away, but the wall prevented him. He was trapped, not just physically, but by the overwhelming force of the wolf's presence. Clara, watching from her prison on the bed, felt a chill run down her spine. The wolf was no ordinary animal. There was something almost supernatural in its calculated calm, in its way of torturing Arthur not with claws and teeth, but with the mere threat of its existence. She saw the pure terror on her grandson's face, the same terror she herself had felt moments before, and a wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. fear of what the wolf might do, but also a dark satisfaction at seeing Arthur, the tormentor, transformed into a victim. It was savage, brutal justice, but justice nonetheless. The spark of hope in her chest burned brighter, fueled by the sight of her tormentor suffering. Suddenly, the wolf took a step back. Its eyes never leaving Arthur, it turned its head slightly, and a low growl, almost a murmur, escaped its throat. But it wasn't a growl for Arthur. It was a sound of warning, directed at the bedroom door. A sound that Clara, with her hearing sharpened by age and fear, also perceived. There was another sound, faint at first, coming from the corridor. A soft scratching, almost inaudible, followed by a metallic creak. Arthur, in his stupor of panic, didn't notice. His eyes were still fixed on the wolf, his mind unable to process any other information. But the wolf did. The creature, which moments before seemed to savor its prey, now displayed a new intensity. Its muscles tensed, and its hunter's stance became that of a protector. It moved quickly, but silently, positioning itself between Arthur and the door, its eyes fixed on the polished wood. The scratching in the corridor intensified, and the metallic creak became more distinct. It was the sound of a lock being forced, of a door slowly opening. Clara felt a new shiver, this time of apprehension. Who else would be in the mansion? Arthur had made sure they were alone. Was it an accomplice, or someone who could help? The uncertainty was almost as terrifying as the wolf's presence. The wolf let out a deeper growl, this time unequivocally a warning, a sound that reverberated through the room's walls. It was no longer a promise of contained violence, but a declaration of war. Its fur bristled along its spine, and its fangs, previously bared in a warning, now seemed ready for combat. It was ready to defend its new territory, its new charge, against any intruder. The bedroom door creaked and began to open slowly, revealing a dark crack. The faint, yellowish light from the corridor crept in, illuminating the blood on the floor and the imposing figure of the wolf. Arthur, finally realizing that the danger might not be just the wolf, turned his head with difficulty, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. What else could be coming? The macabre dance was about to gain new participants, and the stage, previously restricted to 3, now opened for a new act of horror and uncertainty. The bedroom door, once a promise of escape or new torment, opened a little wider, revealing a slender silhouette against the faint yellowish light of the corridor. It wasn't the imposing figure Arthur expected, nor the shadow of an accomplice. It was a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy bun and eyes wide with surprise. She wore simple work clothes and carried a worn fabric bag slung over her shoulder. It was Sophia, the granddaughter of a former housekeeper who had come to the mansion to check on Clara. Concerned by the unusual silence, her eyes, accustomed to the dimness of the corridor, swept the room and froze. What she saw defied all logic, all sanity. The floor, once a priceless Persian rug, was now a tapestry of blood and rodent remains, a macabre battlefield. The metallic, putrid smell hit her nostrils like a punch, mixing with the wild musk emanating from the creature at the center of the scene. The wolf, with its dark fur and gleaming eyes, looked like a statue of terror and power. It stood there, imposing, between the door and what Sophia was only now beginning to process. Arthur, cowering against the wall, pale and sweating, and Clara tied to the bed, her eyes fixed on the beast with disturbing intensity. Sophia's bag slipped from her shoulder, falling to the floor with a muffled thud. But she didn't notice. Her mind, in shock, desperately tried to make sense of that infernal vision. The wolf did not move. Its eyes, previously fixed on Arthur, now turned to Sophia, assessing the new intruder with a cold, calculating intelligence. A low, almost inaudible growl vibrated in its throat, a clear warning that she had invaded sacred territory, a sanctuary of blood and vengeance. its muscles tensed beneath its fur, every fiber ready for attack, for the defense of its new alpha. Arthur, seeing Sophia, felt a flicker of irrational hope. "Sophia," he managed to murmur, his voice hoarse and almost inaudible, a thread of sound that barely broke the oppressive silence. But his appeal was more a moan of despair than a cry for help. He was trapped, and Sophia's arrival seemed only to add another victim to the stage of his own cruelty. Clara, for her part, felt a shiver of apprehension. Sophia was a good, naive girl, and now she was there in the midst of that nightmare. Her eyes, previously fixed on the wolf and Arthur, now divided between the beast and the young woman, a new concern overriding her own situation. She wanted to scream, to warn Sophia to flee, but her voice was trapped, her throat dry, and the fear of provoking the wolf kept her silent. Sophia took a hesitant step back, her eyes fixed on the wolf. The creature was real, palpable, and its penetrating gaze seemed to read her soul, stripping bare her deepest fear. She could smell the blood, the oppressive heat of the room, the electric tension in the air. It was as if she had stepped into a living nightmare, and with each passing second, the reality of the situation hit her harder. The wolf took a slow, deliberate step in Sophia's direction. It wasn't an attack, but a display of power, a reminder of who was the true master of that domain. Its eyes showed no anger, but an unquestionable authority, a silent threat that was more terrifying than any growl. It was marking its territory, setting the boundaries for the new intruder. Sophia, paralyzed by terror, felt her legs weaken. She tried to retreat again, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor. The wolf was a few feet from her, and with every fiber of her being, she knew she was at the mercy of that beast. The air felt thin, and with each breath, she smelled the wild, damp scent of the wolf, mixed with the metallic aroma of blood. Suddenly, the wolf stopped. Its eyes, previously fixed on Sophia, shifted for an instant to Clara, a silent acknowledgement, a confirmation of its loyalty. Then they returned to Sophia, but with a new intensity, a final warning. It would not attack her, not yet, as long as she posed no direct threat. But her presence was an intrusion, and the wolf would make sure that was clear. Sophia, in a fit of panic, raised her hands in a gesture of surrender, a silent plea for clemency. Her lips trembled, and she felt tears welling in her eyes. She didn't know what to do, where to go. The wolf was an insurmountable barrier, and the horror that surrounded her was overwhelming. Arthur, observing the scene from his corner, felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief at not being the wolf's immediate focus, but frustration that Sophia was not the salvation he had hoped for. She was just another witness, another piece in the cruel game he had started, and which was now completely out of his control. The wolf, with an almost imperceptible movement, lowered its head slightly, a gesture that seemed to say, "You have been warned." Then it turned, not turning its back on Sophia, but positioning itself to have a full view of the room, of Arthur, of Clara, and of the door. It was the guardian, the judge, the executioner, and in that moment, everyone in the room was a mere pawn on its savage chessboard. Silence reigned again, broken only by Sophia's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of everyone's hearts. The corridor light, once a promise, now seemed like a trap, illuminating the entrance to a private hell. Sophia was trapped, not by physical force, but by paralyzing terror, by the wolf's imposing presence, and by the unspeakable horror that had invaded. The macabre dance had gained another participant, and the tension in the room was so dense it seemed to suffocate. The air in the room was a nauseating mix of iron and damp earth, the smell of fresh blood and the wolf's wild musk. Sophia, still paralyzed, felt every fiber of her body scream in protest, but her feet seemed glued to the bloody floor. Her eyes, previously fixed on the beast, now swept the macabre scene, desperately trying to find an anchor in reality. But there was none. The Persian rug, which she knew so well, was unrecognizable, an abstract canvas of dark red and shapeless fragments. What were those small bodies? Her mind refused to fully process the image of the slaughtered rodents, the brutality of the scene. The wolf, with its dark fur and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages, was the gravitational center of that particular hell. It no longer growled, but its presence was a silent, constant growl, a palpable threat that filled every cubic inch of the room. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine, a cold that didn't come from the environment, but from the pure terror emanating from the creature. She was no longer a person, but an intruder, an object under the relentless scrutiny of a predator. Clara, tied to the bed, watched Sophia with an intensity the young woman couldn't decipher. There was fear in the elderly woman's eyes, yes, but also a strange urgency. A silent plea that Sophia felt in her soul. Clara wanted to say something, to warn her, but her mouth was dry, her voice trapped by terror and the wolf's dominant presence. She could only move her eyes, a frantic dance between Sophia and the beast, a mute warning that the danger was real, immediate. Arthur, cowering in the corner, was a pathetic figure, a stark contrast to the arrogant and cruel man Sophia knew. He seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of minutes, his face pale and sweaty, his eyes wide with a panic bordering on madness. He mumbled something again, an unintelligible sound lost in the room's tension. Sophia barely noticed him. Her attention was completely dominated by the wolf. The creature took another slow step, this time not towards Sophia, but to position itself even more strategically. It stood between Sophia and Clara's bed, a living, muscular barrier. Its eyes, previously focused on the young woman, now alternated between her and the elderly woman, a confirmation of its priority. Clara was its protected one. Sophia was a variable to be controlled. Sophia, feeling the weight of that gaze, finally managed to find a thread of voice, a hoarse whisper that barely broke the oppressive silence. "Grandma, Clara?" she asked, her voice trembling, a plea for confirmation that all of this was real, that the woman she loved was there, alive, despite everything. The wolf reacted, not with an attack, but with a subtle movement of its head, its eyes fixed on Sophia, a clear warning that any attempt to approach would be interpreted as a threat. A low growl, almost a hum, vibrated in its throat, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, a primal reminder of its power. Clara, seeing Sophia's intention to approach, felt a growing despair. She shook her head slightly, an almost imperceptible movement, but one that Sophia, with her sharpened attention, caught. "No!" Clara's eyes seemed to plead. "Don't come closer, it's dangerous." Sophia, torn between the desire to help the elderly woman and the paralyzing terror of the wolf, felt tears stream down her face. She couldn't think, couldn't act. Her body was in a state of shock, her mind struggling to process the avalanche of sensory and emotional information. The smell of blood, the wolf, Arthur, Clara tied up. It was too much. The wolf, as if reading Sophia's hesitation, took another step, this time to the left, maintaining its distance but solidifying its position. It was drawing an invisible line on the floor, a boundary Sophia should not cross. Its muscles were tense, ready, but its posture was one of control, not blind fury. There was a cold intelligence in its movements, a calculated strategy. Arthur, from his corner, watched the scene with a mixture of panic and a hint of distorted hope. If Sophia could somehow distract the wolf, perhaps he could do something. But what? He was cornered, helpless, and Sophia's presence seemed only to complicate his situation further, adding another witness to his humiliating failure. He tried to move, a small shuffle of his feet, but the sound was enough to draw the wolf's attention for a brief instant. The wolf's eyes turned to Arthur, and the growl in its throat intensified, a clear warning that it had not forgotten the grandson. Arthur froze again, sweat trickling down his forehead, panic resurfacing with full force. He was prey, and the wolf was the predator, the master of that domain. With each passing second, reality twisted further for Sophia. What had begun as a routine visit to her grandmother had transformed into a living nightmare, a scene ripped from the depths of dark fairy tales. The wolf, with its dark fur and eyes that gleamed with an almost human intelligence, was the center of it all. It was not a random threat, but a guardian, a judge, and perhaps an executioner. Its movements were calculated, each step a declaration of power, each gaze a warning. Sophia felt the cold of the bloody floor through her shoes, the metallic smell of blood impregnating her nostrils, the oppressive heat of the room that seemed to suck the air from her lungs. She tried to swallow, but her throat was dry, scratchy. Fear was no longer an emotion, but a condition, a state of being. She was immersed in it, drowning. The wolf, with an almost imperceptible movement of its head, shifted its gaze from Sophia to Arthur, and then to Clara, as if taking an inventory of its prey and its protected one. Its eyes lingered a little longer on Clara, a silent acknowledgement, a confirmation of its loyalty. Then they returned to Sophia, but with a new intensity, a final warning. It would not attack her, not yet, as long as she posed no direct threat, but her presence was an intrusion, and the wolf would make sure that was clear. Sophia, in a silent fit of panic, raised her hands in a gesture of surrender, a silent plea for clemency. Her lips trembled, and she felt tears welling in her eyes. She didn't know what to do, where to go. The wolf was an insurmountable barrier, and the horror that surrounded her was overwhelming. She could feel the weight of the wolf's gaze, an invisible pressure that held her in place, unable to move, unable to think clearly. Time seemed to have stopped, stretched into an eternity of terror and uncertainty. With each heartbeat, she felt danger approach. With each breath, the certainty that her life hung by a thread. Time for Sophia had dissolved into a sticky swamp of fear and disorientation. Each second was an eternity, each beat of her heart a war drum echoing in the oppressive emptiness of the room. She stood there, but did not feel standing. She felt suspended, floating in an ether of horror, her feet stuck to the bloody floor, her mind in a whirlwind of grotesque and terrifying images. The smell of iron and damp earth, once a dissonant note, was now the dominant symphony, permeating her clothes, her hair, her very skin. The wolf, the creature, was the anchor of that entire nightmare. Its eyes, once merely menacing, now seemed to carry a weight of judgment, a cold intelligence that assessed her, weighed her, measured her. Sophia raised her hands in an instinctive gesture of surrender, a mute plea for clemency, though she didn't know exactly for what. Her lips trembled, tears welled up, but did not fall. They were frozen, trapped by shock, as was her entire body. She could feel the weight of the wolf's gaze, an invisible pressure that held her in place, unable to move, unable to think clearly. With each beat of her heart, she felt danger approaching. With each breath, the certainty that her life hung by a thread. But it wasn't just her life at stake. There was Clara, her grandmother, tied to the bed, a frail and defenseless figure at the center of all that madness. Clara's eyes, still fixed on Sophia, were a silent scream, a warning the young woman couldn't fully decipher. There was fear, yes, but also an urgency, a plea that seemed to go beyond immediate terror. It was as if Clara was trying to convey a vital message, something Sophia needed to understand to survive. The wolf, as if reading the silent connection between the two women, took another slow step, this time to the right, always keeping itself between Sophia and the bed. Its dark fur seemed to absorb the little light from the corridor, transforming it into an even more imposing silhouette, a dark guardian. It didn't growl openly, but the vibration in its throat was a constant reminder of its power, a primal threat that resonated in Sophia's bones. It was drawing an invisible line on the floor, a boundary she should not cross, a barrier of blood and savagery. Arthur, cowering in the corner, was almost a footnote in Sophia's landscape of terror. His pathetic figure, his unintelligible murmurs were just background noise amidst the deafening silence the wolf imposed. But, for an instant, Sophia noticed a movement in Arthur's eyes, a spark of distorted hope as he watched the interaction between her and the wolf. He was waiting for something, hoping she would be the distraction needed for his own escape. The revulsion Sophia felt for him, even amidst her own panic, was a brief reminder that not all evil in that room had four paws. Suddenly, the wolf tilted its head slightly, its eyes fixed on a point beyond Sophia, towards the bedroom door. There was no sound, but the creature seemed to detect something. A subtle change in the atmosphere, a presence Sophia couldn't perceive. The growl in its throat intensified, a deeper, more profound sound that seemed to come from an ancient, wild place. Its muscles tensed further, and its posture of control gave way to a more aggressive readiness, an alert. Sophia felt an even more intense chill run down her spine. Was there something else? Another threat? Or was the wolf merely reinforcing its dominance, its territory? She didn't know, but the change in the beast's attitude was undeniable, and it only heightened the already unbearable tension. Her eyes instinctively followed the direction of the wolf's gaze, but she saw nothing beyond the darkness of the corridor, which now seemed even deeper and more menacing. Clara, noticing the change in the wolf, reacted with a spasm. Her eyes widened, and she tried to struggle against her bonds, a weak, desperate movement. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, only a hoarse gasp. The despair in her eyes was palpable, and Sophia felt a new kind of terror, one that didn't come from the wolf, but from her grandmother's helplessness. Clara was trying to warn her again, with even greater urgency. The wolf, with a swift and fluid movement, turned its body, positioning itself to have a clear view of the door, and at the same time, keep Sophia and Clara in its line of sight. It was a machine of vigilance, a predator at the peak of its form, and every fiber of its being was alert. The barrier of blood from the slaughtered rodents, once an image of horror, now seemed like a line of defense, a warning to anyone who dared approach. Sophia, seizing the wolf's momentary distraction, felt an irrational urge to run, to scream, to do anything to break the spell of terror that held her. But her feet refused to obey. Her mind was in a tug-of-war between the instinct to flee and the paralysis of fear. She was trapped, not by chains, but by the overwhelming presence of the beast and the uncertainty of what would come next. Silence reigned again, broken only by Sophia's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of everyone's hearts. The faint light from the corridor, once a promise of salvation, now seemed only to illuminate the entrance to an even greater abyss of terror. The subtle dragging in the corridor was not the sound of human footsteps, nor the rustling of a common rat. It was something heavier, wetter, a sound that seemed to scrape the very darkness, dragging itself like a shapeless, sticky mass. The wolf's growl, once a warning, now transformed into a guttural vibration, a tremor that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, a primal alert that resonated in Sophia's bones. Its eyes, previously fixed on her with a judging intensity, were now completely turned towards the door, gleaming with a wild fury, a readiness for battle that went beyond simple territorial defense. Sophia felt the air thin even further, as if the new presence was sucking all the oxygen from the room. The smell of blood and damp earth, already nauseating, now mixed with an even more repulsive odor, a stench of sewage, mold, and decaying flesh, which seemed to materialize from the dark corridor itself. It was an ancient smell, of something that lived in the depths, far from the light, feeding on oblivion and filth. Clara, tied to the bed, reacted with a violent spasm. Her wide eyes, previously fixed on Sophia with a silent plea, now darted to the door with pure and absolute terror. She struggled with a strength Sophia didn't know her grandmother possessed, a desperation that made the ropes creak. Her lips moved frantically, trying to form words, but only a hoarse, breathless hiss escaped, a sound that was more a groan of agony than anything else. It was as if Clara was seeing hell itself open before her, a vision that young Sophia could not yet comprehend. The wolf took a slow step back, positioning itself even more strategically between the door and the bed. Its posture was that of an ancient warrior, every muscle tense, every hair bristling. It wasn't just guarding, it was preparing for war. The barrier of blood from the dead rodents, once a scene of horror, now seemed like a sacred frontier, a sacrifice to keep evil at bay. But whatever was coming, it seemed to care nothing for barriers. Arthur, cowering in the corner, finally reacted to the new threat. His murmurs abruptly ceased, replaced by a sharp screech of terror. He cowered even further, trying to merge with the wall, his eyes wide with panic, fixed on the darkness of the corridor. There was a recognition in his gaze, a terror that suggested he knew what was coming, or at least had an idea of what it was capable of. Sophia's revulsion for him mingled with a pang of morbid curiosity. What could so terrify a monster like Arthur? The dragging grew louder, closer. Now Sophia could distinguish a wet, sucking sound, as if something heavy and viscous was moving over a wet surface. A shadow began to form in the doorway, a dark mass that seemed to distort the faint light, making it even denser and more menacing. It wasn't a defined silhouette, but a pulsating, formless blotch that slowly expanded, filling the doorframe. The wolf let out a growl that was no longer a warning, but a challenge, a war cry that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. It lowered its head slightly, baring its sharp teeth, and its claws extended, scratching the bloody floor with a dry, sharp sound. It was ready to fight to the death. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine, a cold that didn't come from the environment, but from a terrible understanding that was beginning to form in her mind. The wolf was not just a wild animal, it was a guardian, a protector, and whatever was coming from the corridor was evil personified, something it had been sent to combat. Her mind, previously paralyzed by fear, now desperately tried to process the new layer of horror. And then the creature revealed itself, or at least part of it. It wasn't a single being, but a twisted mass of bodies. A grotesque aberration that seemed to have been stitched together from the worst nightmares. It was a tangle of rats, but not common rats. They were gigantic rodents with glowing red eyes and yellowed teeth, their fur matted and dirty, forming a single pulsating entity. They moved as one, their bodies contorting and fusing, a thing with multiple heads and paws, dragging itself into the room. It was the Rat King of urban legends, but elevated to an unimaginable scale of horror, a living abomination born from darkness and putrefaction. The smell of sewage and death intensified, almost suffocating Sophia. She could see the glowing red eyes in the gloom, countless hungry pairs of eyes fixed on the wolf and then on Clara. The creature had no voice, but the collective whisper of thousands of tiny squeaks and teeth grinding was more terrifying than any roar. It was a symphony of dread, the promise of a slow and agonizing death. The wolf, facing the abomination, did not hesitate. Its growl transformed into a primal howl, a call to battle that seemed to echo through the house walls. It advanced a step, shielding Clara with its body, its eyes fixed on the writhing mass of rodents. The barrier of dead rats' blood on the floor, once a protection, was now merely a reminder of what was to come, a premonition that the true battle was just beginning. Sophia felt a scream trapped in her throat, a terror so profound that it completely paralyzed her. She was in the midst of a war between good and evil, between wild nature and abomination, and her life and her grandmother's depended on the outcome. The wolf attacked first, a dark blur of speed and power. It didn't aim for the throat, but for the king's front paws, a tactic to destabilize the opponent. The Rat King, however, was more agile than its mass suggested. It dodged with a surprising movement, whipping its thick tail towards the wolf's face. The blow was swift, but the wolf recoiled in time, a growl of frustration escaping its throat. The battle began in a whirlwind of teeth, claws, and fur. The wolf was a fighting machine, its movements fluid and precise, each attack calculated to inflict maximum damage. But the Rat King was a formidable adversary, its ferocity and resilience shocking. It did not retreat, showed no fear, only blind rage and an insatiable desire to destroy. Its shrill squeals mixed with the wolf's deep growls, creating an infernal symphony that echoed through the room's walls, a sound that seemed to tear the very air. Sophia could see the blood. Not just the blood of the dead rats on the floor, but new stains, dark against the wolf's fur, and a viscous trail the Rat King left behind. Every strike, every bite was real, brutal. Life and death were being decided there, just a few feet from her, and she was merely a helpless spectator. Clara, with superhuman effort, managed to lift her head, her eyes fixed on the battle. There was a fierce determination in her gaze now, a silent plea for the wolf to win. It was as if she knew that the wolf's defeat would mean not just death, but something far worse, a desecration, a condemnation that went beyond the physical. The wolf, in a daring move, leaped onto the Rat King, trying to bite its neck. But the giant rodent spun, and its sharp claws tore into the wolf's flank, ripping off a piece of flesh and fur. The wolf let out a howl of pain, a sound that made Sophia flinch, but it did not retreat. Its determination was unwavering. It recovered in an instant, its eyes burning with renewed fury, and this time it aimed with surgical precision. The wolf's jaw clamped around the Rat King's hind leg, crushing bones with an audible snap that made Sophia gasp. The rodent's squeal turned into a cry of agony, and it thrashed frantically, trying to free itself. The wolf did not let go. It shook its head violently, tearing the flesh, and the Rat King fell to its side, its ferocity momentarily broken by the excruciating pain. But the creature was not dead. With surprising effort, it dragged itself, using its front paws, its red eyes still fixed on the wolf with pure hatred, a promise of vengeance. The smell of its own blood, mixed with the stench of putrefaction, filled the air, making the atmosphere even more suffocating, almost palpable. Sophia, amidst the horror, realized something. The wolf, though wounded, seemed to be winning. But victory would not come without a cost. And what would happen next? What would the wolf do once the threat was eliminated? Would it protect her? Or would she be the next prey? The uncertainty was almost as terrifying as the battle before her. Time, which had previously dragged in an eternity of fear, now flew in a whirlwind of violence and despair. The end was near, but Sophia didn't know if it would be the end of the nightmare or the beginning of an even worse one. The wolf, with a final warning growl, prepared for the finishing blow, its eyes fixed on the wounded creature, the promise of annihilation gleaming in its wild depths. The wolf did not hesitate. With a growl that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, it lunged at the wounded Rat King. There was no longer any tactic, only the primal fury of an alpha predator. Its teeth, once a precise weapon, were now tools of brutal annihilation. The powerful jaw clamped down again, this time not on the paw, but on the creature's thick, filthy neck. There was a dry snap, a horrifying sound of cartilage and bones breaking, which echoed in the room's momentary silence. The Rat King's squeal was abruptly cut short, transforming into a choked gurgle, a bubbling of blood and air that extinguished in a final spasm. The colossal rodent's body thrashed for an instant, its claws scratching the air in a final agony, before falling inert, a grotesque pile of matted fur and torn flesh. The wolf did not let go. It shook its head with savage violence, ensuring that life had been completely extirpated from that abomination. Only then, with a guttural sigh, did it release its prey, which rolled to the side. Its red eyes, now opaque and lifeless, fixed on an empty spot on the ceiling. A heavy, absolute silence fell upon the room, not the silence of peace, but the silence of death, exhaustion, and the horror that still hung in the air. Sophia felt her body relax, but not in relief. It was the release of such extreme tension that left her limp, empty, as if all her energy had been drained. Her ears buzzed, and the smell... oh, the smell was unbearable. The stench of the Rat King's putrefaction mingled with the metallic aroma of the smaller rodent's blood, with damp mold and the cold sweat of panic. It was an olfactory symphony of hell, permeating every fiber of her being. Her eyes, still wide, swept the scene. The floor was a sticky, dark carpet of blood and viscera, a macabre landscape of death. The bodies of the smaller rats formed a grotesque barrier, now reinforced by the colossal corpse of the king. And at the center of it all, the wolf. It stood still, panting, its chest rising and falling rhythmically. There was blood on its fur, oozing from a deep gash on its flank and staining its jaws. But its eyes, those amber eyes, still gleamed with a wild intensity fixed on Sophia. She felt a chill run down her spine. The threat of the rats had been eliminated, but the wolf. The wolf was still there. And now, with no visible enemies, where would its ferocity turn? Would she be next, or Clara? The uncertainty was a slow poison, corroding what little sanity she had left. Clara, tied to the bed, let out a faint moan. Her eyes, previously filled with an ancestral terror, now seemed to carry the weight of deep exhaustion, but also a strange spark of gratitude, or perhaps just the acceptance of an inevitable fate. She no longer struggled, merely watched the wolf with a quietness that was almost as unsettling as the previous frenzy. The wolf, as if sensing Sophia's gaze, moved, not towards her, but in a slow, deliberate circle around the bed. It sniffed the rat bodies, inspecting its work with an almost ritualistic seriousness. Then, to Sophia's horror, it began to lick the blood from its own wound. It was an act of self-preservation, but amidst that grotesque scene, it seemed like a demon feasting. It stopped again, a few feet from Sophia, its eyes fixed on her. There was no longer a growl, nor an aggressive posture, just a silent, intense observation that made her feel completely exposed, vulnerable. She could feel the warmth of its breath, the scent of a wild beast, now mixed with blood. It was a smell that should inspire fear, but there was something more, something that drew her in, a morbid curiosity. Suddenly, the wolf let out a sound, not a growl nor a howl, but a low huff, almost a grunt, and then it turned. With surprising agility, it leapt over the barrier of dead rats, landing softly on the other side, near the door. Its eyes swept the dark corridor for a moment, as if searching for more threats, or perhaps for an exit. Sophia held her breath. Would it leave? Would it abandon her there with her grandmother tied up, Arthur catatonic, and the floor covered in death? The idea of being abandoned in that nightmare was almost as terrifying as the wolf's presence. But it did not leave. Instead, the wolf turned back to the room, and its eyes fixed on Arthur, cowering in the corner. For a long moment, the wolf observed the grandson, who still trembled uncontrollably, his eyes glazed over, completely oblivious to the carnage surrounding him. It was as if the wolf was assessing, judging the source of all that chaos, the sick mind that had orchestrated such cruelty. A low, deep growl began to vibrate in the wolf's throat, a sound not of rage, but of primal contempt, of silent condemnation. It took a step towards Arthur, and Sophia felt her heart pound again. What would it do? Would it attack the grandson, the true monster of that story? Before the wolf could take another step, a sound from the corridor broke the tension again. It wasn't the viscous dragging of rats, nor the shrill squeal. It was a more subtle, but equally chilling sound. A muffled hiss, like something being dragged across a rough surface, and the faint click of metal against metal. The wolf froze, its eyes turning to the door with impressive speed. The growl in its throat deepened, transforming into a guttural warning more intense than any Sophia had ever heard. It wasn't the sound of an animal, but of a machine, of something that didn't belong in that organic nightmare. The tension, which had lessened for an instant, now rose to a completely new level, a premonition that the horror was about to gain an even colder, more calculating dimension. The wolf, once the apex of savagery, now seemed like a sentinel, preparing for an enemy that perhaps even it could not slaughter. The muffled hiss, previously subtle, intensified, transforming into a more distinct metallic dragging, like rusty gears turning in a heavy yet silent mechanism. The click of metal against metal became more frequent, rhythmic, approaching the door. It wasn't the sound of human footsteps, nor the dragging of an animal. It was something cold, impersonal, and infinitely more disturbing. The wolf, its muscles tense beneath its blood-stained fur, now growled incessantly, a low, continuous sound that vibrated in the air, a primal warning to anything that dared cross that threshold. Its amber eyes, previously focused on annihilation, were now beacons of alert, sweeping the darkness of the corridor. Sophia felt her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic drum in her chest. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the battle against the rats now seemed to drain away, leaving her with overwhelming exhaustion. But terror prevented her from giving in. What could be worse than the Rat King? What could make the wolf, such a formidable predator, hesitate and assume such an intense defensive posture? Her mind, already on the verge of collapse, desperately tried to find a logic, an explanation for this new horror. And then, the shadow, a tall, angular silhouette began to emerge from the darkness of the corridor, blocking the faint light coming from some distant crack. It wasn't a man. It wasn't an animal. It was a machine. A robot, Sophia thought, with a chill that made her tremble uncontrollably. The metallic creature, approximately 2 meters tall, glided on a track base, its movements almost frictionless, save for the persistent hiss and occasional click. Its body was made of dark, matte metal, without reflections, and instead of a head, it possessed a set of red lenses that rotated slowly, like hungry eyes, sweeping the room. From the sides of its torso, 2 articulated arms extended, each ending not in hands, but in sharp, rotating claws, like saw blades, which emitted a low, menacing hum. It was a killing machine, cold, calculating, designed for annihilation. Arthur. Only he could have something like this. That monster had planned everything, every contingency, every stage of his sadistic game. The wolf, with a furious roar that made the room tremble, charged. It did not wait. It did not hesitate. It was a force of nature against man's perverse creation. It leaped over the barrier of dead rats, ignoring the pain of its own wounds, and lunged at the machine with savage ferocity. Its blood-stained teeth tried to sink into the dark metal of the articulated arm, but the metal was impenetrable. The wolf's fangs scraped with a sharp, irritating sound, leaving no mark. The machine, in turn, reacted with terrifying speed. One of the rotating claws activated with a louder hum, and in a fluid movement struck the wolf on its flank. It wasn't a cut. It was a brutal impact, a blow that made the wolf howl in pain and stagger back, falling onto the bodies of the rats. The blow had not torn its skin, but the force had been enough to stun it, to show that this was not a prey of flesh and bone. Sophia felt a chilling despair take hold of her. The wolf, her unlikely protector, her last ray of hope, was wounded, exhausted, and now faced something that seemed invulnerable. The machine had no fear, no pain, no emotions. It was just brutal efficiency. Clara, beside her, let out a low lament, her eyes wide with horror, fixed on the machine that now advanced methodically into the room. Ignoring the barrier of dead rodents, the wolf, shaking its head, got up with difficulty. There was a glimmer of confusion in its eyes, an incomprehension before this inorganic enemy. But its fury had not diminished. It growled again, lower, more cautiously, circling the machine, looking for a weak point that perhaps didn't exist. The machine, in turn, rotated its red lenses, fixing them on the wolf, and the rotating claws emitted a constant hum as if ready for the next attack. The air in the room was dense with the smell of blood, metal, and electrical odors emanating from the machine. It was a nauseating mixture that suffocated Sophia. She looked at Arthur, cowering in the corner, still in his catatonic trance. He did not see, did not hear, did not feel the horror he had unleashed. It was a cruel irony. The creator of the nightmare was immune to his own torment, while Sophia and Clara were forced to witness the final battle for their lives. The wolf made another move, this time more calculated. It tried to flank the machine, seeking to attack from behind, but the machine was fast, its infrared sensors detecting every movement. It rotated on its tracks with surprising agility, keeping its sharp claws pointed at the wolf. A red beam of light, thin as a laser, emanated from one of the lenses, tracing a precise path on the floor, mere inches from the wolf's paw. It was a warning, a threat. Sophia realized that the machine wasn't just there to clean up. It was there to finish, to eliminate any witnesses, any trace of what had happened. And the wolf, powerful as it was fighting a battle it couldn't win with brute force. It was dealing with something beyond its primal comprehension. The end was approaching, and this time, not even the forest's alpha seemed capable of stopping it. Sophia's terror was no longer the fear of death, but the fear of cold, impersonal annihilation, orchestrated by a sick mind and executed by a soulless machine. The wolf, with a growl that seemed to tear its own throat, tried again. This time it didn't charge with the same blind fury, but with calculated agility, dodging the rotating claws that hummed like metallic wasps. It tried to bite the base of the track, where the metal seemed less robust, but the machine spun on itself with surprising speed, and the sharp claw descended, scraping dangerously close to its hind paw. The sound of metal against metal, the smell of ozone mixed with blood, everything intensified, suffocating Sophia. She watched, paralyzed, feeling helplessness corrode her soul. The machine showed no fatigue, did not bleed, felt no pain. It was the perfect antithesis of the wolf, an implacable, inorganic force against primal savagery. The wolf, exhausted, its fur stained with the rat's blood, and now with new wounds beginning to seep, was at an overwhelming disadvantage. It growled, but the sound was more a lament of frustration than a war cry. Its amber eyes, once so full of fury, now showed a glimmer of confusion, of a primal incomprehension before that invulnerable enemy. The machine, as if assessing its prey's resistance, launched another attack. One of the rotating claws extended with a fluid and precise movement, striking the wolf's shoulder. This time, it wasn't just an impact. The blades tore through skin and flesh, and the wolf let out a howl of pain that echoed through the room, a harrowing sound that made Sophia feel a knot in her throat. It staggered, falling to its knees, blood gushing from the deep wound. Clara let out a muffled moan beside Sophia, her eyes fixed on the wounded wolf, as if she knew that the animal's fall would mean the end for all of them. The machine did not wait. It advanced, its red lenses fixed on the fallen wolf, its claws humming in anticipation. It was the final blow, the cold, impersonal annihilation Sophia so feared. But the wolf, even wounded and on the verge of defeat, was no ordinary animal. It was an alpha, and an alpha does not give up. With an explosion of energy that seemed to come from the deepest part of its wild essence, the wolf propelled itself upward. Not to attack the metallic body, but for something more specific, something Sophia noticed in a flash of hope. Its eyes, even blurred by pain, had fixed on the machine's red lenses. The robot's eyes. It was a small but vital target. With a final roar, a sound that was more defiance than pain, the wolf leapt. It wasn't a graceful leap, but a desperate act, driven by the sheer will to survive. It launched itself against the machine's head, ignoring the claws that tried to intercept it. Its blood-stained fangs sank with all its remaining strength into one of the red lenses. A loud, sharp snap echoed through the room, followed by an electrical hiss. The lens shattered, red fragments flying through the air. The wolf, with a violent shake of its head, managed to tear out what remained of the lens, leaving a dark, smoking hole in its place. But the price was high. In the same instant, the machine's other rotating claw, now disoriented for a moment, struck the wolf with full force on its flank. It was a devastating blow. The wolf was thrown against the wall with brutal force, falling in a heap of fur and muscle, a low, weak moan escaping its throat. It did not move again. The machine, in turn, stopped. Its tracks ceased their hiss, and the hum of the claws diminished, transforming into an irregular murmur. The remaining red lens spun frantically, like a blind eye desperately searching for something it couldn't find. Its movements became erratic, less precise. It rotated in slow circles, its claws extending and retracting without a clear pattern, occasionally striking against the bodies of the dead rats. There was a heavy silence in the room, broken only by the machine's intermittent hiss and Sophia's ragged breathing. The wolf was motionless. The machine was damaged but still operational, a blind and erratic monster. Sophia felt a wave of despair and a strange gratitude. The wolf had sacrificed itself. It had given her a chance, however small. But what to do now? The machine was still an imminent threat, and now it was even more unpredictable. Suddenly, the machine stopped rotating. The remaining red lens fixed on Arthur, cowering in the corner. For a moment, Sophia thought the robot, in its disorientation, had finally noticed the grandson. But no, the lens began to flash, a sign that something was wrong. And then, a metallic, cold, emotionless voice echoed through the room, coming from some internal speaker of the machine. Primary target, failure. Secondary targets, undefined. Security protocol, activated. Eliminate all residual threats. Initiating environment scan. The voice was Arthur's, or rather a robotic, distorted version of Arthur's voice. He had programmed that machine with his own voice. Horror chilled Sophia to the bone. The machine was not just damaged, it had changed protocol. And now, without the wolf to protect them, Sophia and Clara were the residual threats. Arthur's sadistic game was far from over, and the next chapter would be played against a blind, yet lethal machine, programmed for annihilation. The wolf had bought them time, but at what cost? And would that time be enough for Sophia to find a way to survive the final nightmare? The machine began to glide again, slowly, its claws humming with a new and terrifying cadence. The machine's hum, once a precise, murderous cadence, was now an erratic lament, a sound that seemed to tear at Sophia's air and nerves. Arthur's distorted metallic voice still echoed in her ears. Eliminate all residual threats. Terror chilled her to the bone. The wolf had sacrificed itself, tearing out the mechanical beast's eye, but its Pyrrhic victory had transformed a focused predator into a blind, unpredictable monster, programmed for indiscriminate annihilation. The machine glided again, its tracks scraping the blood-stained floor. Its movements were clumsy, like those of a wounded insect. The single remaining red lens spun frantically, sweeping the room in wide, unfocused arcs, like a desperate eye searching for an image it couldn't process. The claws, once so lethal in their precision, now extended and retracted without a clear pattern, occasionally striking against the bodies of the dead rats, raising clouds of dust and the nauseating smell of viscera. Sophia felt an even deeper despair than before. The wolf, her unlikely savior, lay motionless against the wall, a heap of fur and blood. Its sacrifice had been an act of primal bravery, but now, without its protection, Sophia and Clara were just two defenseless targets, tied to the bed, at the mercy of a machine that no longer had discernment, only an extermination protocol. Clara, beside her, let out a murmur, her eyes fixed on the advancing machine. The fear on her face was palpable, a mask of silent horror. Arthur, the architect of that entire hell, remained cowering in the corner, oblivious, his mind lost in some abyss of his own creation. The irony was cruel. The metal monster, programmed by him, now moved with his voice, but without his consciousness or what remained of it. The smell in the room was unbearable. Blood, ozone, burnt metal, and the subtle smoke that still emanated from the dark hole where the machine's lens had been. Every noise, every erratic movement of the robot was a blow to Sophia's heart. She tried to move, pulling at the bonds that held her wrists and ankles, but they were firm, unbreakable. The bed, her prison, was also her last refuge, but for how long? The machine continued its scan, approaching the bed in a spiral movement. The remaining red lens flashed as if trying to recalibrate. Secondary target, heat detection, initiating approach. Arthur's cold, robotic voice filled the silence again. The machine could not see, but it could feel. Heat detection. That was how it would find them, even blind. Sophia felt panic transform into a cold fury. She could not die like this. Not after everything, not after the wolf. She looked around desperately, searching for anything, any object, any flaw. The room was a war zone, overturned furniture, the floor covered with dead rats, the barrier of blood. The machine, in its erratic movement, had knocked over a bookshelf, scattering volumes and papers across the floor. A metal bedside lamp, with its bulb broken, lay near the headboard. The machine was now a few feet from the bed. The hum of its claws was loud, almost deafening. They extended and retracted, scraping the floor, ready for attack. Sophia could feel the heat emanating from the metallic body, a heat that was not of life, but of circuits and motors. The remaining red lens fixed in the direction of the bed, although its movements were still imprecise. Secondary target. Confirmed. Elimination protocol. Executing. Arthur's voice. It was as if he were there, watching, commanding her own death. Sophia closed her eyes for an instant, searching for a strength she didn't know she possessed. The wolf. It had fought to the end. She would do the same. She opened her eyes and focused on the machine. It was blind, but not deaf, and it was not invulnerable. The wolf had proven that. The machine made a more direct movement, its tracks whirring with a sharp hiss. One of its claws extended, hitting the side of the bed with a dull thud. The wooden frame groaned. Clara let out a muffled scream, and Sophia felt the bed tremble. The machine was testing, probing. It couldn't see, but it knew something was there. Suddenly, Sophia noticed something. On the floor, near the overturned bookshelf, an exposed electrical wire. The lamp. It had been pulled from the socket when the shelf fell. The wire lay there, just a few inches from the path the machine was taking. It was a chance, small, desperate, but a chance. If she could somehow guide the machine, blind it further, or perhaps overload it. But how, tied up as she was? The machine recoiled slightly, its claws spinning faster, as if preparing for a more forceful attack. Elimination of residual threats, maximum priority. Arthur's voice. Sophia looked at Clara, at Arthur, at the fallen wolf. She was the only one who could do something. She needed a plan, and fast. Time was running out. The machine was about to attack, and this time there was no Alpha to stand between them and cold, impersonal annihilation. The electrical wire. It was her only hope. But how to reach it? And how to use it against a machine that was, in essence, electricity and metal? The machine's next move would be decisive. The machine advanced, its claws humming with renewed ferocity, a sound that promised the end. The remaining red lens pulsed, a blind beacon of destruction. Sophia felt the vibration on the floor, the air heavy with the imminent threat. She couldn't reach the wire with her hands, but perhaps she could use her body. With fierce determination, she began to writhe, pulling at her bonds with all her remaining strength. The pain was excruciating, the ropes cutting into her skin, but she ignored it. Her goal was to move the bed, if only by a few inches. "Grandma, what are you doing?" Clara whispered, terror in her voice. "Hold on, my dear," Sophia replied, her voice hoarse, her teeth clenched. She pushed with her feet, arched her back, using her body weight to try and shift the heavy bed frame. It was a monumental effort. The machine was just a meter away, its claws extended, scraping at the air. The bed groaned, the old wood protesting under the tension. Slowly, painfully, it began to move. A millimeter, then another. The exposed electrical wire was now a little closer, but still out of reach. Sophia needed more. She pushed again, a muffled cry escaping her lips. The machine, in its erratic advance, seemed to hesitate for an instant, the red lens flashing faster as if confused by the change in the environment. Secondary target, movement detected, re-evaluating trajectory. Arthur's metallic voice. Sophia saw her chance. The machine was realigning, but its movements were slow and clumsy. She needed the robot to pass exactly over the wire. With one last, desperate shove, she managed to move the bed enough so that the electrical wire lay directly in the path of the machine's tracks. The robot, following its heat detection protocol, continued its advance. Its heavy tracks rolled over the floor covered in blood and dead rats. And then, with a dry snap and a bluish flash, one of the tracks hit the exposed electrical wire. A violent short circuit. The air filled with the acrid smell of ozone and burnt metal. Sparks flew, illuminating the room for an instant with a ghostly light. The machine shuddered, letting out a sharp, electronic screech that made Sophia's ears ache. The remaining red lens flashed frantically, then went dark. The hum of the claws ceased abruptly. The robot's metallic body trembled violently as if having a seizure, and then with a dull thud, toppled over. Its track stopped, its claws inert. Silence. A heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by Sophia's and Clara's ragged breathing, and the distant hiss of something still burning inside the machine. The smell of smoke and ozone was strong, but the immediate terror had dissipated. Sophia closed her eyes, feeling warm tears stream down her temples. She had succeeded, she had defeated the machine. But at what cost? The wolf lay motionless, Arthur was catatonic, and she and Clara were still tied up. With renewed effort, Sophia tried to free herself. The ropes seemed looser now, perhaps from sweat and movement. She pulled, twisted, feeling her skin tear, but adrenaline propelled her. Finally, with a painful rip, one of her wrists broke free. The relief was immense, but brief. She quickly began to untie the other bonds. Minutes later, her hands free, Sophia untied Clara, who hugged her tightly, trembling. "Grandma, we made it," Clara sobbed. Sophia held her close, feeling her granddaughter's fragility. "Yes, my love, we did." She turned to the wolf. With a heavy heart, she dragged herself to it, ignoring the pain in her own limbs. The wolf's body was cold and stiff, covered in blood. Its eyes were glazed over, but still held a trace of the bravery that had driven it. Sophia touched its soft fur, feeling deep gratitude and overwhelming sadness. It had been a monster, a predator, but also her savior. "He saved us, Clara," Sophia whispered, her voice choked. "He saved us." The room was in ruins, a testament to the brutal battle. The dead rats, the barrier of blood, the inert machine, the fallen wolf, and Arthur still cowering in the corner, a pathetic and terrifying figure. Sophia knew the fight wasn't completely over. There was the police to call, explanations to give, a grandson to face, no matter what state he was in. But for now, they were alive. They had survived. And the silence, once so menacing, was now a balm. The nightmare had come to an end, and the faint light of dawn began to seep through the curtain gaps, promising a new day, even if stained with darkness.